Morning and welcome to our analysis on CAT 2016. So, all of you would have taken CAT yesterday and would have gone through multiple analysis by various experts over the last few hours. And you would have had your own experiences, whether in slot 1 or in slot 2. Let me give you my take on CAT as it happened yesterday. This was my ninth or 10th attempt in CAT, and comparing it with what I have seen of CAT from 1990, 2003 onwards till now, I would say that CAT has started going back to its basics in terms of testing more of conceptual knowledge rather than calculations or formulae or just direct questions. So in that sense, CAT is going back to being the prime qualitative exam that it always was, compared to just being a methodical exam. My slot was the first slot in Pune and the same center that I had last year. And what I saw this time was that there was a lot more organization, very little chaos, very systematic. So you had to go with your photograph on the admit card. You were allowed to take only your admit card and an ID proof into the exam hall. We were not allowed to even wear footwear inside the ID hall, the exam hall. So in that sense, it was all very well organized. The CAT authorities frankly need to be complimented for this organization over just one day. Coming to the actual exam and the interface. The overall interface of CAT was more or less the same as last year. So you had features like mark for review, you had features like hiding the question palette by using the arrow, which was a right left arrow. The important thing was that when you wanted to get your answer saved, you had to click on save and next to move on to the next answer. If you selected something and went to the next answer, then it would not automatically get selected. So the entire tutorial was given in great detail earlier by the authorities on the CAT website as well as on the CAT interface during the exam. Now let's come to the actual exam and the various sections within the exam. One big change in the entire interface as far as the actual exam was concerned was that there were no subsections. If you notice last year's CAT, within the verbal section you had a subsection on VA and a subsection on RC. So you could attempt all the RC questions together, you could attempt all the VA questions together. That was not the case this time round. I'll go into greater detail sometime later. Similarly in DI and LR. Last year you had one subsection on DI where you could identify all 4 DI questions together, and with LR all 4 LR questions together. That was not present this time around there as well. So that became a challenge in the actual exam, and as I explain each section you will understand as to why it became a challenge. So let me start with the first section, which is VA. The breakup of the VA section was the same as what we saw last year. 24 questions on RCs and 10 questions on verbal ability. There was no vocabulary as expected in CAT. There was no grammar as we had speculated. The 24 RCs were split into 5 RC passages, 3 passages of 6 questions each and 2 passages of 3 questions each. The word length, and this is one important area that you need to keep in mind for next year's CAT as well when you start preparing. Compared to earlier CATs or old CATs, CAT has now started moving towards much shorter passages. So if you look at the passages which were for 3 questions, the word length was hardly 300 to 350 words. One passage was 295 words, the other was 348 words. So that's a very small passage. On the other hand, the passages having 6 questions were anywhere between 450 words to 650 words. So when I counted those 3 passages, one was in the 470 odd range, one was around 540 and one was around 640. So that way they were moderately long passages. Now, what were the kind of areas that were covered in these passages? So my passages covered 5 different areas. One was on socio-economic aspects of shared pain in groups or cults. This was probably the only passage which was similar to what you would have seen in CAT 6 years back or 7 years back, when CAT used to really love socio-economic and socio-political passages. One passage was on two different educational systems, that is a starfish based system and a spider based system. Again, slightly similar to what you would have seen earlier, but quite easier. The third passage was on the evolution of languages, or how languages will evolve over the next maybe 100 years or 150 years. So these three were the six question passages and were slightly, I would say, similar to what you would have seen in earlier CATs. The two shortish passages were different. One was a very factual passage on Bhutan and its efforts to conserve biodiversity, while the other was on the importance of household work and how it affects various stakeholders in that entire process. So these were the five passages. Now, if you look at the kind of topics that they have covered, one is socio-economic, the first one that I said. One is language. The third is education. So again, socio-economic. Bhutan is environment and climate change. And household work is sort of current affairs because they had touched on social aspects of household work in today's scenario. So if you notice, CAT has moved drastically from what used to be very art based and philosophy based heavy passages. Earlier CAT passages, if you look at CAT 2007, 8, 9, 10, you would see that you had very dense passages. So they would have taken, let's say, something from a William Shakespeare or some classical book or a discovery of India and would have asked you a passage from there. That is no longer the case. They'll take up recent articles, they'll take up recent material and give it to you. This is what we saw yesterday as well. What were the kind of questions? What I observed, and I am primarily not a verbal guy, but I would still say this, having solved CAT for 10 years. The questions were a broad mix of factual and inferential questions. Yes, I did not have questions such as tone of the passage or title for the passage, but there were inferential questions as well. However, I would say that if you had read the passage well for the first time and then moved on to the questions, you would have been able to find the source of those questions very quickly within the passage. I clearly remember from yesterday's CAT that I was able to eliminate a couple of answer options in each question straight away. Then there were just two relatively close answers which I had to eliminate. If you were to go back and read just that much paragraph again, you would be able to answer the question very easily. In fact, some questions were so direct where they said that in the fourth paragraph of this passage, what is the author alluding to? Those kind of questions. So you knew where do I go and search them. So in that sense, they were definitely far more doable compared to what I saw last year. Coming to the second part, okay, so in my earlier analysis that I have shared with people before CAT, where I've said attempt this much, attempt that much, I used to tell people that 3 passages out of 5, approximately 15 questions should be good. Here I would revise my opinion and say, based on yesterday's feedback, and I have spoken to students as well as faculty here for slot 2 as well, the overall feedback is that 4 passages could easily have been attempted. So I would revise my opinion and say 20 attempts. 19 to 20 attempts is easily something that could have been achieved in RC. I managed to attempt all 24, but that is different because I don't have any pressure on my head. So I can afford to even lose marks. In your case, anywhere around 3.5 to 4 passages, maybe the 3 6 question ones and one of the 3 question ones would have been a great attempt. Now let's move on to the pure VA based questions. The breakup was standard. 3 paragraph summary questions, 3 to 4 jumbled sentences, and 3 to 4 odd man sentences, or what is called contextual odd man out, where you have a set of 4 to 5 sentences which can form a paragraph and one of them can be removed. Now this, I would say, was the tougher subsection compared to VA. Why do I say that? Understand this, even though you didn't have negative marking, in jumbled sentences, you did not have any option on which you could base your sentence formation. Plus, some of these sentences were such that the most evident starter was actually not the start sentence of the passage. So they were trick questions. I would say if you were not sure, you should not have wasted time on the jumbled sentences. The contextual odd man out was still doable, but I would rate them as moderate. On the other hand, if you did RCs first, then the para summaries would have been, I won't call it a cakewalk, but it would have been easy because they were very similar to RC and you could have then attempted the para summary well. So the three to four para summary questions that you had should definitely have been attempted. Among the jumbled sentences and the contextual odd man out questions, some of them could have been attempted. In general, I would say 20 to 21 questions in RC and anywhere between 5 to 6 questions in verbal would have been a reasonably good attempt. 25 is something that you should have definitely touched. Anything above that, I would call it a bonus. Now, what was the challenge in this section? As I said, there was no subsection. So, the way the questions were structured was question 1, paragraph summary, question 2, jumbled sentences, question 3 to 8, RC, then 2 or 3 jumbled sentences again, then suddenly an RC again. So, you had to keep changing your focus in terms of how do I approach an RC versus how do I approach a non-MCQ question. Plus, you have to go and find where each RC started because there was no indicator telling you whether the RC starts from 3 or from 4, which meant that you have to go through the entire section, identify the start point of each RC, then identify which of the RCs you wanted to do first, solve them and go back to the other RCs. That would have helped you save a lot of time. So this challenge is something which of course we will factor into all our mocks that we give you now for next year. But this also tells you that when you go for CAT next year, you should not have preconceived notions as to how you will have the entire paper in front of you. So that sort of completes the verbal section. I would say easiest of all 3 sections this year, easier compared to last year. That is my verdict on verbal. Now let me go on to DILR. Since the last 2 years, 2014 and 15, DILR has been the toughest section in CAT. For people like me who have done our MBAs in the mid 2000s or early 2000s, we have been exposed to CAT 2000 to 2008. And this is the kind of DILR that we used to face when CAT was paper based and we used to take CAT on a serious basis. Earlier CAT used to have DI which was logical in nature. If you observe the DI from last 2 years, they don't ask you a bar graph and ask you to calculate percentage growth, or they don't ask you a pie chart or a line or a radar or those kind of things. Lot of these sets will be pure table based sets and the table will look very innocuous, very simple. But then if you see the kind of effort that is required in each table is humongous. Plus you need to understand what the table is asking for. So let me start here like verbal. I'll not start with what LR was and what DI was, and I'll explain why I'm not doing that. But the first challenge was there was no separate section on DI, there was no separate section on LR, which means all 8 sets could be called DI or LR. My paper had 3 sets which were tabular in nature, but the kind of effort that was required in them was more LR based than DI based. The pure LR sets actually required a lot more understanding. In general, I would say the difficulty level, while it was marginally less compared to last year. I remember when I saw last year's DI sets, out of 4, there were 2 or 3 sets which were like simply undoable. Here, I would say there wasn't any set which was undoable or unsolvable, but all of them were quite difficult by themselves. In English, there is a phrase called sum of parts being greater than the whole. which means that if you take each of the DI sets, they were doable by themselves. But if you add all 8 sets and try to solve all of them, then the whole section becomes very difficult. So in this section, the key was question selection. I always tell students attempt 4 sets out of 8 in DILR and you're through. If you are able to attempt the 5th set, great. And that is the target that I had also kept for myself in yesterday's CAT. So the DI and LR sets were enmeshed together. There was a second level of challenge. In last year's CAT, there were certain sets which were pure numerical entry questions. So there was, for example, last year there was a set on Venn diagrams. If you solved it, you just kept entering the answer and you would get those 4 questions done straight away. Then there were some sets which were purely MCQ. And in LR, when you're often solving MCQ, you can look at the answer, go back to the question and solve it again. That helps. Here the trick was some questions were MCQs, then you went to the third, so they sucked you in. The first question was an easy MCQ. So you saw the set, you're like, okay, I can do this. You saw the question, you started off, then you went to the next question, slightly more difficult, solved it. Then you came to the third question, which was a numerical entry question. And then you're like, okay, what do I do now? So each set had a mixture, or I would say at least 6 out of 8 sets in my slot had a mixture of MCQ and numerical entry questions. So you could not keep a strategy whereby you said I would attempt any, or I would any as in numerical entry questions, or I would not attempt them. You had to take a call on the spot. I had 3 sets based on tables, a couple of sets which were based on concepts of Venn diagrams, and I have been telling students since the last 5 years or 6 years now that Venn diagrams is a perennial favorite of CAT examiners because it is a very conceptual topic. It uses the basics of set theory, hence it can be used as either a quant question, which I had Venn diagrams in quant as well. So you can use it as a quant question, you can use it as a DI set, you can use it as an LR set. Hence that is something that you should never ever miss. I had 2 to 3 sets which were mixed with tables as Venn diagrams. I had a couple of matrix based set, one purely numerical logic based set which was based on derangements which you study in PNC and probability. So these sets, plus there was one very easy looking set which I would call probably the most tricky set on trains. 7 or 8 people wanting to go to a certain destination by various trains. Looked very easy, data was very easy, but then you had to apply conditions in each question. So that way, again I would say question selection was very critical here. Nearly every set had questions which were conditional in nature, which means that you could not just solve a set and attempt all 4 questions. You had to solve a set partially, go to the question, solve it, move to the next question, then understand the condition there, solve it again, move to the third question, and so on. So that was another challenge that we faced. So these 3 challenges that we had in DILR, mixture of DILR sets, mixture of MCQ and numerical entry question, and a lot of conditional questions made DILR difficult. The second slot also had its share of difficult DI and LR. We've received similar feedback in terms of the overall paper structure, in the sense that DI and LR was mixed, MCQ and theta or any questions were mixed, etc. etc. I have heard feedback from students that they got some code based questions which were easy. However, students in the first slot should not worry that because people in the second slot got a couple of easy sets, they'll end up getting more marks and they'll end up getting a better percentile. It doesn't work that way. There will be some amount of normalization. There will be 1 or 2 sets which are common to both slots, because they will use that to sort of benchmark both slots and normalize your scores. So those things will happen in time, and that in that sense you should not really worry about whether my slot was tougher or your slot was easier. If your slot was tougher, it was tougher for everybody in that slot. So everybody's marks obviously go up or down accordingly. What should have been the number of good attempts in DI and LR? I would say Four sets was the bare minimum. In the first lot, I will tell you the sets that I attempted, which I felt were doable. There was a set on trains where 8 students had to go and reach one destination, which was tough, but I did that first. Then there was a set on movies releasing in various stages. That was based on the concepts of basic ratio, proportion, and percentages. That was doable. Then there was a set on tables where you had one table with various percentages, percentage of male literates and percentage of people graduating and those kind of things. So that again was doable if you took out some time and understood the concepts of percentages. So these were three that I attempted. Then I don't remember the other set, but there was one more on Venn diagrams which I attempted. So these were 4 or 5. Then there was one on matrix where you had girls and the t-shirts that they bought of various colors. That was slightly easy again. So 4 to 5 sets definitely worth doing. And you could have attempted each set in approximately 12 to 13 minutes. I was timing myself at the end of each set, and I remember when I finished the fourth set, I had some 7 to 8 minutes left, whereby I then went and attempted the fifth one. So that way, 18 questions could have been attempted, 20 would have been a very good attempt. So there was when I said, there will be some set which will be overlapping between both the slots. There was one set on technical and technical workers which was common to both the slots. So that might be used as a reference point. Of course, that does not mean that if you didn't attempt that set, it will affect your percentile. Don't be under that kind of illusion. So here 18 attempts, 16 attempts bare minimum, 18 decent, 20 good. This should have been the kind of breakup in DILR. Difficulty level with respect to last year, I would say slightly easier in relative terms. Okay, so you cannot call DILR easy. Relatively easier compared to last year, but definitely on the tough side. Moving to the third and last section, QA. Overall structure wise, this was similar. Two major surprises. Last year, the proportion of theta questions or numerical entry questions was much higher. And I myself have been telling students expect 12 to 15 questions, expect 12 to 15 questions. Because last year we got 13, somebody got 14 out of 34. This time, in both slots, we've heard that people did not get more than 7 to 8 questions, at the most 9 questions from this area. So everything else was MCQ, which means that the chances of negative marking increase proportionately, which then means that your question selection becomes more important. So that was challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 was that the questions were more application oriented compared to just formula based questions. If you go and look at the analysis of last year's CAT, you would realize that last year there were a lot of questions which were much more direct in nature. You knew the formula, you could solve it and move ahead. This year the questions looked simple enough, but they had to be done with some application of formulae. There was often a mixture of two concepts. So those kind of things were very important this year. What was the kind of breakup? There were approximately 9 to 10 questions that I saw on arithmetic, which included concepts of averages, profit and loss, which was a surprise to me because CAT generally doesn't use stuff like that. So there was profit and loss, which was a surprise. Mixtures and allegations, again a surprise. Compound interest, big surprise. Very little on time and work and time and distance. So within arithmetic, they shifted the goalpost a bit by covering newer areas and ignoring some of the old favorites. Similarly, 9 to 10 questions on algebra, which included the old favorite numbers. So there were a few questions on numbers, but I didn't see any of those old monster style questions, where people just couldn't understand how to solve this. Plus, I didn't see really formula based questions, number of factors, sum of factors, divisibility rules, those kind of things. So if you didn't need to worry that, oh, if I don't need the formula, what do I do? Formulas became important in another area which I'll come to in a minute. But in as far as numbers and algebra is concerned, you had questions which are more application oriented. Whether it was numbers, whether it was quadratic equations, whether it was inequalities. In fact, quadratic equations and inequalities probably had some of the simplest questions in the whole section. Then there was a major focus on geometry. Geometry again would have been anywhere around 8 to 9 questions, but they were split into various areas. So you had mensuration, and mensuration did not cover just a normal figure, it had a triangular prism, for instance. Then you had questions on circles, triangles, cyclic quadrilaterals, all applied concepts. Questions on area of trapezium, but not direct, so you had to do a lot of work around it. Question on rectangle, again not direct, lot of work involved. So unless you were very sure in geometry, actually this was one area where you could have left out a lot of questions because of the increased weightage on arithmetic. The 9 to 10 arithmetic questions would have easily given you more marks than the 8 to 9 questions on geometry. Similarly, the equation and inequality based questions in algebra were easier compared to whatever you saw in geometry. Finally, coming to the last 6 or 7 questions or 8 questions that I saw from modern math, which include sequences and series, functions, PNC, probability. I didn't see anything from functions or probability in my paper, but there was definitely a lot of sequences and series. Questions on AP, GP, and these were all application oriented. So here, when I said a few minutes back that you needed formula, one, you needed the formula in geometry because there were 2 or 3 concepts applied at the same time. Sequences series, you definitely needed to know the concepts of AP, the formula for AP, the concepts for GP, formula for GP, and so on. In this section, I found one question on GP where there was definitely a typing error. And that question, I mean, based on what they had given, there was no question left. They wanted a common ratio and 2 terms were equated. The term with which they were being equated was given as the same. So you ended up getting common ratio as 1. So that was one of the questions where I felt, of course I could be wrong, I may have missed out something. But in my opinion, that question had a typo error. Some of the other APGP questions were very good qualitatively. So as a faculty, I really enjoyed solving those questions. As a student, I might have left some of them. I had 1 or 2 questions on PNC which were slightly challenging. So that again may or may not have been attempted based on your other attempts. No data sufficiency as usual. So data sufficiency is one area which seems to have really gone out of favor with CAT over the last few years. In general, if I were to rate quant compared to last year, I would say it was definitely 30 to 40% tougher compared to what I saw last year. The questions on logarithms, surds, etc. were easy. There was another issue in quant which has been pointed out by many students, is that the root sign was not appearing properly on the screen. For example, I was seeing the root sign like pi. To some students it was seeming like sigma. And the minute you see a root sign looking like pi in a geometry question, there was a question on trapezium where I had to find a certain length and 2 options looked like pi something to me. And that minute I just freaked out in the sense that how can I have pi in a trapezium? And it just shook all my concepts. So these small things were minor jolts in the quant section compared to the other sections where everything was good. So apart from these small issues, I would say in general the quant section was good, slightly tougher. Last year it was the easiest. I would say this year it was moderate. But you could have attempted 22 to 25 questions or 20 to 23 questions based on your capabilities easily. You had to search for the right questions. I ended up attempting 22 questions there, and then I didn't really attempt it in the last 2-3 minutes. But I'm saying even with you, 22 questions or 21 questions could have been easily attempted. Right selection matters a lot. So I'll just summarize my entire experience of CAT or the experience of the paper. Verbal, easy section. anywhere around 20 attempts in RC and 5 to 6 attempts in the pure VA, which makes it 26 attempts. DILR, tough as usual, however easier compared to last year. So anywhere between 18 to 20 attempts, damn good, 16 attempts bare minimum. Quant, tougher than last year, but still easy to moderate, it can be said. So 20 attempts bare minimum, 25 attempts great, anything between that doable. With these three attempt levels, of course, when I say these kind of attempts, I'm assuming an accuracy of 85 to 90%. So if you come back to me and say I attempted 25 questions but I'm not sure of half of my answers, then no, I can't help you. But with these, I would say you're in for a good percentile. At this stage, I cannot say that it can will be a 99 plus or a 98 plus, but definitely this can be considered as a good performance as on today. When we then get our results, we'll get to know finally how good or bad it is. Finally, yes, one small issue that happened yesterday evening was that in the second slot, there was an issue of somebody taking pics, live pics of the DI sets and uploading it on various fora. However, CAT authorities have assured that this has been stopped in its tracks. There is not going to be any re-exam. So guys, please do not overstress yourself. Those of you who are preparing for SNAP, continue doing that. Those of you preparing for ZAT now can start preparing for ZAT. I do not think that CAT will have a retest now. Okay, so wish you all the very best. And whatever may have happened, you might have a great, good, average, or bad attempt yesterday. That should not affect your further exams in any way. That day is gone, you cannot change it now. So you should now move on to the next test and try to do it, try to attempt it to the best of your abilities. Wish you all the very best and do well. Thank you.